Hi, I'm Walker Robertson, and I'm here interviewing Janet Hess about the Vietnam War. Where were you prior to the Vietnam War?
I was in grade school, so I don't have many memories of the war.
2. What were you doing in 1955 when the war first started?
I was in seventh grade, living in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, uh, attending the junior high there.
Was the media for the war or against it at first? Did they change?
What I don't remember exactly what you're asking. I do know though that the Vietnam War was the first war where we actually had live TV coverage, and so everything was very vivid and brought right into our living rooms, and that was really unusual.
Did the war report more graphically than today? Did they report all the bombs and deaths, or is it similar to how it's reported today?
I'm not sure, but as I said, it was very graphic to us at the time. I think there were a lot of cover-ups. I'm not sure that we ever knew exactly the number of deaths until much later.
Were there protests you remember seeing in the news or on television?
Oh yes,
And where were they usually?
college campuses in California, big cities.
So you were born in central Pennsylvania, but then you moved here when you were older. Do you think the war effort was any different here than it was in central Pennsylvania?
I actually didn't move here until I was an adult, so my only remembrances are when I was in Mechanicsburg and in college.
And then how did you feel the presidents handled the war? Between like JFK and LBJ and Eisenhower and Nixon.
Well, we got into it during Eisenhower's reign,
Yes.
and who knows what would have happened if Kennedy had lived and had longer to serve as president. LBJ increased the war effort, but he refused to run for a second term because he got so much flack about that. So I guess really Nixon was president when the war ended. I don't know that he really deserves credit for that, though.
And then how do you remember hearing about the Kent State Massacre?
Only on TV and in the newspapers.
How did you feel about the foreigners in the country at this time?
I don't remember having any feelings.
Did you start to get tired of the war? When was this point?
I don't remember that either.
Did the music, TV shows, and radio programs change with the war?
Oh, yes.
And how did they change?
Well, there were a lot of protests involved in the shows. I'm not sure if that's when MASH began or not, but MASH was supposed to be about the Korean War, but it was really, I think, motivated by the Vietnam War and the anti-war feelings of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what they showed about the Korean War would have been also true of the Vietnam War, except for the geography.
Looking back.
And then we had programs like the Smothers Brothers, and we had groups like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and they were all singing protest songs. So that's where Blowing in the Wind and If I Had a Hammer, that's where those songs originated. They were protest songs.
Were you ever involved in any protests?
No, if I protested at all during that time, it would have been for civil rights, and I did do some of that.
And then looking back, how do you view the war? Was it necessary?
That's one of those 6 of one and half a dozen of the other kind of questions. I think it's important for there to be freedom everywhere around the world, and it seems like through history our country has been involved in ensuring that.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we lost an awful lot of young men during that war, and there has to be a better way to settle conflict than actual guns and tanks and bombs and killings.
What was the most memorable event you have from the Vietnam War?
Well, I'm going to switch to another question because they're linked.
Mhm.
I think the most vivid thing for me was that my college friend, Danny O'Sullivan, was drafted, and so he signed up and went in as an officer, and he, I believe, had two different tours in Vietnam. One of the tours, at least, was he was in charge of the officers club on the base, and I think he was in Saigon. When he came back from the war, and when he was no longer serving in Vietnam itself, he was part of a special unit of 3 men and him, who went to the funerals of the soldiers when they came back to do the taps at the graveside. That was a very emotional and very draining duty, but it was also an honor. And so I remember that just so vividly. And then I also remember that his wife and son were here in this country, still left behind. And so Sheila, my friend, was raising their child alone, so that the difficulty extended to her too.
So how long was he there for?
I think 6 years,
6 years.
or in 2 different tours.
And do you remember him being like different when he came back?
Well, he was more mature, but then he was older. So I don't think that Danny actually did any fighting. So it would have been more what he saw from the men who were doing the fighting.
Okay. And then at your church, were there groups for veterans coming back? Did you do any help for the veterans with soup kitchens or helping them find a job or anything like that?
Don't I wish? There was very little of that in the country, but I do know that my friend Richard's home church brought over and sponsored a Vietnamese family and helped them to get settled here in this country. They later came here to Philadelphia, the family did, and they had a restaurant down in Chinatown, a Vietnamese restaurant. And at least once a year, Richard and Bill and I would go to that restaurant and visit with them and eat their very, very good food.
And there were many people who were conscientious observers and chose not to fight in the war. What was your take on this? Were they being loyal or just exercising their rights?
Again, that's one of those 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I could see both sides of that. It was a really, really disturbing time. And there were so many young men who just could not embrace the reasons for that war, and just didn't see that they had any other choice. So some of them went to Canada, some of them signed up as conscientious objectors. I think that those who were COs had a lot of trouble in the army, in the armed forces. I think they received a lot of grief for their positions. And, the soldiers just ragged on them a lot.
What should we have learned from the war as applies to Desert Storm and the ongoing war right now?
Well, I think we should have learned that we could get out. We could leave. Because we left Vietnam and the country survived. Now the war broke out again, but the country has survived and is doing pretty well right now. So I think we could leave the Mid-East and they would manage without us. So that's a lesson we should have learned, but I don't know that we actually have.
Thank you.